I'm joined by Wickd, obviously I had him on loads of these, and RichsWrath, which is obviously formerly HUK Rich, just that for some weird reason he changed that name right before we started doing all this thing, so we have to awkwardly intro it every time. But we're gradually getting used to it, and he obviously used to work with HUK and now does a mixture of player representation in League of Legends, actually does represent some LEC players, and then bizarrely, almost like some sort of sick joke that is the Black Mirror element of this industry, is some sort of like semi-pro Call of Duty coach. I don't know, that almost sounds like, dude, Rich, you're supposed to be in this circle of people where we're all like the legit people with like integrity in the industry. That sounds like everyone has to sell out to some degree in the industry. Like, what the hell?
I think when you put it like that, that literally seems like the kind of thing if you click on your average like 13-year-old esports like fans Twitter page, it will be in his bio, you know, like semi-professional
Sure.
Call of Duty coach. But no, yeah, it's Gamer Sensei, shameless plug. Let me up. Thank you very much.
By the way, when you actually do it, when you do like the coaching people, you've talked a little bit in the past that you said like it's basically the equivalent to if you went to like a local club and like a tennis pro just taught you some shit or whatever, right? Do you actually know the game Call of Duty well? Are you actually in that world, or is it more like like just the concept of how to coach someone up with their skills? What are you doing with them in that sense?
So I'm more involved in like the battle royale side, like the Warzone side, which obviously has a really messed up scene, but an incredibly popular scene with lots of money and stuff. So it's like a mixture of like casuals and people who want to like get involved because it's very sort of open circuit. Anyone can join in. It's not locked in like CDL or anything like that. And I have like a lot of experience in playing tournaments in battle royale games in general, but also my previous history, like playing COD at a very high level. So yeah, it's mainly like teaching battle royale aspects and methodology with like FPS mechanics essentially, and my hands haven't like completely betrayed me yet, so yeah, it's kind of both sides of it.
By the way, this is just a random aside. I know I haven't talked about it myself that much on shows because I tend to find it a bit of a played out topic. But that whole thing that you were alluding to there, where anyone who's over, I think the cut-off date from memory it's usually about 24. Anyone who's over the age of 24 always claims all that shit of like, oh, my reflexes fall. Like, I think it's absolute nonsense. I have to say, as someone who's played games like my whole life, like it is literally, in my opinion, just the amount of time you put into the game, and also, by the way, mentality. Like, if you have a self-limiting belief set and you really believe that you suddenly are like mechanically limited because you're 26 or something, like, yeah, that'll do it for you. That'll make sure you don't hit any of those shots. But in my opinion, if you really go into it with like an open mindset of like there isn't a problem, and until one sort of raises its head, I'll assume I can aim properly. I don't think it's even real, mate.
I think there's obviously like an anecdotal side where I can be like, oh, look at this pro, like Taz, Pasha, like these guys were all over 30 and they won a major. Like, yeah, that's true. And I think that is indicative of that being a truism in general. But also like from a personal perspective, I mean, I've always been like a very, what you'd call like a flicky player, like precise, like fast mouse movement player.
Sure.
And I don't feel like that's diminished on any FPS game that I played after, from when I was like 18, 16, 20 to like 30 now. Like, I don't think it's made any difference at all. I think I can do it just as fast and accurately as before. So I don't know. I mean, maybe when you're constantly playing at the top level against up and comers, but again, I feel like there's more of a sort of on the shoulders of giants aspect where it's not necessarily that you've got worse. It's just that the general level has improved anyway.
Yeah, there's that as well.
More precise. Yeah. So I think, as far as I can tell, it's complete myth. I'm sure at some point in your 30s, like maybe as you're hitting 40, maybe there's like some hand-eye stuff that starts to go. But I mean, again, look at Federer, right? Like, sure, now maybe because injury and stuff's caught up, perhaps he's like on the way out. But in terms of his ability and what is probably the most heavily intensive hand-eye coordination game there is in tennis, like, I mean, he wasn't diminished at all, really. So
he kept it going a long time, yeah.
Yeah, so I think, I think it's basically nonsense. At least within the parameters that people work in when they're talking about people in their 20s and stuff, complete nonsense.
Yes.
See me at 40 maybe, but before that,
I'll even throw in as well, like, I know a lot of Americans, unfortunately, I noticed bizarrely, they don't seem to have as many, like, precision sports. I know in theory the NFL would be one, but, like, I'm talking about, like, darts, snooker. Dude, you go look at these sports, like, the world champion's usually, like, a fucking 50-year-old man in some, well, not so much in snooker now, but, like, historically it was, for sure. Like, again, it's something where, like, there's no way the precision goes away. What do you think, Wickd? Like, do you actually think, like, put it this way, if I could, like, reset your brain and you wanted to actually be a pro now and you just played all day long, could you be as good as you were at your peak, whenever that would be? Do you believe it changes?
I think you can definitely become as good, and I don't really think age is a problem until like mid-30s, as you guys said earlier. Like, the thing is also, one problem for gamers is they're unhealthy. that's obviously a problem that will make them get worse quicker, right, with age. And then also, I think a big problem is just that, as we talked about previously in different episodes, coaches are incompetent. So especially in League of Legends, like, you're 24, out. But if you look right now, Doinby is kind of older, Jankos is kind of older. These players are dominating, even though they're older. It doesn't really matter, right? The problem is just the people thought it mattered. It was the same with, I think, many years ago, Hard won World's Championship, I think, at 28 or something.
Yeah.
And then if you look at CSGO, which is more intensive, the players are also older, right? So it doesn't really make any sense. And if I look at my reaction time, if I test it, it's faster than it used to be, or at same speed. So it's not really a problem.
I think it's more to do with like mental fatigue than physical fatigue, for sure. Like, I think if you don't look after your mental, I mean, broadly speaking, but your mental health properly, that's far more likely going to lead you down not being as effective in improving over time than it would be physically. But again, that would have nothing to do with age. It would just be the overall grind and the miles that you've essentially walked in your own head, right? Rather than being capped. So yeah, I don't think it's true at all. I think it's one of these weird things that's like been around for a while, where a lot of this stuff has kind of faded away and generally the community's become more educated. But for some reason, that's kind of stuck. Like, people, and the problem is as well that players buy into it as well. I hear players always talking about it in interviews saying, I may be 25 now, but I feel like I've still got it. It's like, okay, like, why are you saying this on stream in front of 200,000 kids? So yeah, I think it's nonsense.
Like, also in football, don't players get better until like 27 or 28 or so? That's when the peak most.
Yeah, your peak is usually between like 28 and 32, give or take, obviously bit position dependent. But again, that's more to do, like, you're physically probably in your prime at like 23 to, let's say, 33, but that's like just the culmination of experience with all like honing your skills, right? So that's like slightly different. But in theory, a test tube kid at 22 would be just as good or as bad as one at 32, really. I mean, yeah, it's not a big deal.
It's also what makes it so weird when people say that, because if you notice, all they're doing is making the only metric that matters. In this case, it's usually just raw mechanical ability as they anecdotally see it. Like, it's nearly always, by the way, just some fucker like, this is why I don't play Lee Sin anymore, which is like, what a weird fucking like super specific reason that you're trying to make some like, you know, widespread thing. I'll even give a reason that they don't think of themselves. Here's a reason why old school junglers who used to be mechanically sick, by the way, Jankos, Smithy, don't tend to play like Lee Sin and go ham all the time. In my opinion, by the way, actual experience means you don't just go in on every fucking queue like all the 17-year-old studs are. Like, the joke there is that guy has to be a god because he's putting himself in bad situations over and over again. Then he has to like play his way out of it, as it were, like old school Doublelift or something. Like, if you're actually super smart, half the time you're not going to want to go ham on these players, are you? Like, you're just going to do what those players tend to do. You pick like a boring champion that helps your team and you just fucking play the map. Like, you don't need, basically they choose not to go that way. So that's why I've never really bought that. It's also why, if you notice, sports stars do a thing which can be annoying, where they go the other way. Like, actual true sportsmen, they take the opposite logic, which is, because they consider experience to be like making you a better player, they tend to actually belabor it the other way, where like LeBron or someone will say he's at his best like now, when it's like, your best was probably about 8 years ago, but you know what I mean? Like, I get what he means by that. He means that, you know, like now he knows more about how to run a team, or probably some like super specific moment he overcame that he thinks made him better. The other thing I would also throw in on this as well is, just like actually with sports stars, like, in my opinion, the number itself in an absolute sense is irrelevant. It's also like, what wear and tear do you have? Like, if you're 36 and a footballer, but you played like Messi since you were like 14 or something, yeah, you could probably be completely knackered. Your body could just be done already. So similarly, if you're looking at the age of these players you're talking about, like someone like Reckless, I mean, he's probably only 24, 25 himself, but look how many fucking years he's played. Like, if he was burned out, I wouldn't blame him. He's played like every single year, almost the whole way. Rookie, all those fuckers. By the way, that's what even shows you the Doinby example, that this angle of mechanics can't be it. Doinby is arguably his best ever form today, years after he won the Worlds, and when in theory he was supposed to be like capped mechanically a few years ago. He's actually like improved, if anything. Right, let's start. Yeah, go on.
Sorry, I just look at LEC, right? Arguably the best jungler. I mean, probably not on form, but you know, top 3 jungler Jankos. Best top laner, I would say, Odoamne. Best AD carry, arguably, I would say Reckless. All these guys have been in the league for, you know, they're probably they might even be the 3 longest standing players in the league, and they're arguably all top 2 in their position. So, yeah.
And they're kind of older. Like, Odoamne is 26, I think, and Yanka's 27 or 26 as well. And then you also have Jisuke in LCS, who is like used to be super aggro player every single time and either entered or won the game alone, right? now he's actually tuned back on inting, and he kind of just wins games more. And he's 25, right? So, I mean, it is experience. That's definitely a thing.
Sure. Right, what about this then? Obviously, this episode is not going to be one where we're sort of scouring tweets and Reddit. It's actually going to be one where, like, there's 3 playoff matches for LEC. We may as well do those. In doing them, we'll get through most of the different narratives, topics, etc., etc. But one thing we thought we'd do, was Rich's idea, it's a pretty good one, though, I think, is being as playoffs is now here, and we have the final 6 teams that are like active still in Europe, and we're going to find the 3 that'll go to Worlds. Obviously, any team that didn't make playoffs, their year is done now. Like, it's over already. They can all start looking either, do they have a team next year? Are they going somewhere in the off season? Well, the team that everyone's going to be thinking that about is obviously Schalke, because they are literally selling the spot to a different organisation, Team BDS, this French organisation. But the interesting detail is, if you watched the Crackdown episode with Dylan Falco, it basically is implied, and I'd heard similar things behind the scenes, that like it's not to be taken for granted that anyone with Schalke will actually be here for whoever the BDS team, whatever they call themselves, next year with that slot. Like, maybe not the coach, maybe no players. It's possible they could choose to sign those players, so that could change. But as far as I know, it was implied to me like everyone's sort of either going to be released or go elsewhere. Like, that's just the way it's going to be. So basically, this is like an end of a type of an era, right? Whatever Schalke represents, it's over. So we talked a little bit about it on some past ones here, Rich. But what do you actually think the meaning of this is? Like, for example, I have to say, one thing is, I don't know German football, so to me, the Schalke angle was never like super significant. Like apparently to some other people, that was like a hype angle, you know? So to me, they were like a good team that often, like, you know, like, I would say punched above their weight is the classic cliche from British sports punditry. I thought they were pretty cool all in all. A few arseholes worked for them, but whatever, it wasn't in the team usually. What are your thoughts on them as an actual org and what their legacy will be, Rich?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, see you later, Darius, little rat. No one's going to rehire that moron, so see him later. What a shame. I mean, it's a French org, so yeah, I think what Dylan says is probably pretty accurate. I think they will basically talk to everyone, and then if they believe, but not from the perspective of you currently have a space and now we're going to think about moving you on or not. But no, you're basically we're interviewing you, and if it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. So even Dylan, who you'd have to say has done a pretty good job, at least holistically over his tenure, isn't secure a spot. The players same. In terms of their overall legacy, I feel like, as you say, they'll be known as a team who overperformed versus, especially if you look at it from like a spend versus results perspective, they probably have the best, outside of G2, because you could argue that even if G2 is the highest spending team, right, that their ratio of spend is astronomically high. So if we take G2 aside, Schalke, I would be pretty much certain, as I have a pretty decent idea of how much money teams spend on salary each year, would be the best of the rest. And, obviously made some really cool story.
I'll use the cursed term because it might be one of the only times it's applicable. They might actually be the team that did Moneyball. Like, aren't they actually probably the only one that's appropriate when you look like way better results than you'd expect? Like, as far as I know, it was basically implied. Like, I've heard some of the players they've gotten even big names didn't get that much money, It's like they got them all kind of usually where they were a bit desperate for a place to go,
Yeah, I mean, I personally think it's like almost impossible to make a purist version of Moneyball work in League, just because there are so many infinite variables that it's insane. But I do know that Dylan at least had elements of that in his thinking when recruiting players. And I'd had conversations with Dylan or other people in Schalke when they were talking about their philosophy of how they're picking people. And he did often in certain areas, not in completely, but there were aspects of certain statistics and stuff which for him were personally really important. Whether he could marry those to certain success trajectories or whatever, I don't know. I haven't seen his stuff, but I know that he was actually pretty interested in that. And you'd have to say, if we're going by results-based analysis, that it worked for him, right?
Sure.
But yeah, I think they created some interesting storylines. Obviously, the Miracle Run was a really great subplot during that year. They were never really serious contenders to win anything, but that's not really surprising. And I do think star power is pretty important, at least in terms of being on the Rift, right? Not in terms of like, oh, this guy's got a big brand, but I do feel like you do need game changers, even as much as the game's kind of drifted somewhat away from like individual performance affecting game results. So they were never really in the position to do that, but I think they did close to as well as they could most splits for what they spent on it. And I think that's a pretty decent legacy to have. And what I would say as well, with all this information, constantly coming out year on year, I posted recently about, G2 lost 10.6 million euros, in 2019. They haven't even posted their 2020 results yet. Schalke were always a team who actually ran very close to net even, if not essentially net even, and were doing that at the same time. So that in itself is pretty impressive, though I'm sure most fans don't really give a damn about that.
What do you think, Wickd? What would the legacy of Schalke be for you?
Honestly, it's just that a football team was an LSC, and apart from that, I don't really care. Also, the last point you mentioned, that fans don't really care about the spending thing. I think the thing is, most fans actually don't know about that, right?
Yes.
That's the problem. Like, I didn't know about that, and I'm actually pretty into League of Legends to some extent. So I think if fans knew about that, I think it would be much, much more important to them, and they actually care about it. But it's really hard because it's information they don't have most of the time, or it's information that maybe it's out there, but you have to look for it, and it's not in your face, right? So I think it's a big problem. But for legacy, I don't really care too much about Schalke in that regard. It's just a football team that I was in, right? And I thought that was cool at the time. And I think the change is fine. It's not a big deal to me.
Yeah, I will say, this is one of those times where I do wish it was like football and you could just look up like the overall payroll and what everyone gets and stuff, because then you'd actually, basically it would make this point that Rich is making for us, which is if you look at like the talent they had in that team, but this way, I would phrase it like this. It looks like whoever the GM was of that team, I'd imagine it was different people over the years, looks like they got pretty much all the best transfers they could at that level at each time. Like, it looks like every year with whatever level they were at, they re-upped pretty well. Like, I was just writing some down here. Like, think of some of these names they've had on the team, right? They've had like Vizi, Nukdok, Odoamne, Opset, Forgiven, Limit. Like, these are all players who like all LEC level talents at different points in time. Or Abadagi, obviously. Like, now, I'll even say, if you look at that, right, everyone might think on that list, one of those names doesn't belong. Actually, the point is, the Forgiven pickup, actually, in my opinion, shows what I think was good about this org. Because the Forgiven pickup, by the way, everyone now in hindsight would go, what an idiot. It's like, that's genius, because what they understood there, it's the reason why Dardoch has had 1 million teams in LCS, is every team knows, if I can make it work temporarily, I've got a way better player than I should have in this position. Like, the only reason people don't want them is because of external factors, not because how good they are at the game. So, like, I even saw that personally when they picked up Forgiven as like a gamble to try and be an elite team. Like, and if, as far as I know from like what their setup was, like that's what everyone thought in the team at the time.
Yeah. Also, what I would say to add a bit of context to people who might have that opinion is, first of all, they were under like no illusions whatsoever. They weren't saying like stupid stuff like, "Oh, Forgiven, he's going to dominate every lane and win us the game," and who cares about reviews or player dynamic. Like, they came in like very wary and basically said like, these are the elephants that we're all aware are in the room. We're aware that this is a big risk. We're aware that this could cause a problem, and we are aware that at a certain point in time you might be kicked from the team, but we feel that we have a right, because again, keep in mind, as you said, that Otto was there and Abadagi was not as consistent, or hadn't had his best moments yet, but was showing a lot of promise, obviously, and they thought this was like a coin flip for Worlds, basically, which is just, apart from anything else, financially a brilliant punt to take. Like, absolutely. And this idea that you might, cause certain amounts of disharmony or something like that, like, I'd take that. I mean, I did take that flip, right? I'd take that flip every time. So they weren't naive about this whatsoever. And yeah, I think that it was a smart decision. And also keep in mind that people forget, or maybe never knew, they were smashing everyone in scrims initially. And you could say when that stopped and when, Schalke didn't perform as well, it might have been, slightly to do with, Forgiven's unwillingness to move on certain champions or whatever. And people be like, oh, okay, this bastard's back and he's playing Caitlyn every lane again, so we need to adapt, and it took them time to adapt. I mean, you can say it happened for any myriad of reasons, right? But initially, it looked like really smart. And I'm sure there's a parallel world where it could have worked, right? So, yeah, I don't think that was, like, stupid on their part. And as you say, I think it's kind of indicative of the kind of decisions they were willing to make. And if you're a team who aren't going to spend that much money, the idea that you take a flip on an incredibly gifted player, with the downside being problems rather than huge financial debt, that seems like a moment to pick your risk-taking, right, absolutely, in that context. So, yeah, I admired it at the time.
But also even now, I still think it's a good decision, right? Because at the end of the day, you don't really care if you're 8th, 9th, or 10th. If it's completely irrelevant. No, like, I don't even know who's 8th right now. Like, I literally don't even know, right? So it doesn't matter. Nobody cares about it. And if you have a higher chance, even if it's a small chance, like if it's a 5% higher chance for making playoffs, that's worth it. Even if it's a gamble. And it doesn't really matter if a player is toxic, because if he's good at the game and you can handle it temporarily, toxic players tend to be good in a team temporarily because you haven't broken the team yet. Eventually they'll break the team, but as long as the team is together and works, because they're in the honeymoon phase, it's actually a good idea. I completely agree with that, and I've tried that before, right? So
sure. One thing actually we could segue this into is a couple of weeks ago when on Some of the Insight we had Jizuke come on, who obviously plays for Evil Geniuses in LCS now. I just straight up asked him something along the lines of did you have any other good offers? Because I was wondering maybe like another LEC team was in the mix after Vitality, and dude, he just straight up said he had 0 offers from LEC and that's why he went to LCS. Not a single LEC team after Vitality offered this guy a spot, even though if you remember, the last year he played in LEC in the spring, Vitality was actually good. Like he was like one of the better players in the league. So to me, that's indicative of exactly what we're talking about here. Because one, he had this bizarre reputation just because he's like a fun-loving guy who trash talks. People think he's mega toxic. That still follows him for some reason. And then secondly, there's this whole angle that people think he is not the conventional player. So even though to me, I actually think the opposite. I think what we're saying here, like, I think if you have Jizuke, right, obviously, if I could, I would choose Caps, Human, the absolute best player. But if I can't pick those players, and here's the difference, I won't go and just get a boring fucking, like, golden glue type player. That's when you go for Jizuke or Leader or something like, the point is you're flipping, of course, but what you're flipping for is the chance to actually be, like, elite, to be, like, a top team. Obviously, by the way, this will be a very relevant conversation when we talk about Vitality later, but, like, to me, these players, it's like there's a reason we have that idiom, beggars can't be choosers. Once you get to their point in time, the downside, you take the downside because the upside it comes with actually is what makes your team get like a miracle third instead of, as I was saying, just be like a decent 6th place team or something, What do you think about that, by the way, Rich? Because I find that crazy from like an agent perspective. Like, how did nobody in Europe want this guy? Like, he made it sound like it was either LCS or ERLs for real.
Yeah, I honestly can't remember the exact moment where, like, what the entire context was of like who was going for who and people's lists of who they wanted at the time. So I can't remember. I do remember it happening. Like, I do remember him not being highly touted for that particular offseason. And the only thing I can think of, or the only thing, sorry, that I remember at the time being one of the reasons was it was after. Who was it? It was one of the rosters had been very successful with like using only rookies, and this was like, I don't know, the 5th time in 6 splits or something that like a rookie roster basically made worlds or whatever. It was something to do with like the perceived success and and he was seen as a recycle option, a suboptimal recycle option, rather than there's loads of talented rookies and loads of people coveting the rookies over him. So that was the main reason. You always have your top teams, right? So even though Vitality was doing better or whatever, or doing decently when he was on the team for a time at least, he wasn't on one of the top couple of teams, so they're ruled out. And then you go down the list, and lots of those teams who are obviously trying to push for worlds or whatever, they're making roster swaps, and they were all buying into the notion of it's more preferable to get a rookie, especially in mid lane, than it is to recycle someone. One, it's a lot cheaper. Again, keep that in mind. And two, especially with the reputation of Europe and mid laners and rookies, that was kind of the perfect storm for, it's much better to get a rookie mid laner in Europe than it is to recycle not one of the top 2 or 3 best mids, essentially.
I thought the other thing we talk about, and then we'll go to just the playoff matchups, is the other team that it was a shame didn't make the playoffs is actually XL, of course, because they were like just outside as they always are. But the difference is, in the past, if they'd have ever made the playoffs, they also would have like gone out immediately. It was more like the idea they could have made it was cool. This time around feels like the most unsatisfying one because almost everyone, it seems like, has the take, which is they look pretty good actually. Like of all the teams that didn't make it, they look at the best, and they might have been an interesting sort of dark horse. Like, kind of says it all to me that they did lose loads of the games even when they made the player changes. But all that needs to be said is the Marcoon guy still had 4 Player of the Game awards, and I think they only won something like 5 or 6 games, so it's like fucking hell. So the sad thing I think about this one is this is one of the areas where League of Legends as a game sucks if you come from CSGO. In CSGO, I don't have to go, well, I'll just wait, check Swatch. like 6 months so I can watch them play again. Like, what the fuck? And remember, then you also have to remember the dark element, which is maybe they don't, maybe some contracts are up, like, that's one of the sad things, you can't sort of run it back. Like, I'd like to just watch this team play a split now. Like, I'm sort of ready to sign up for the next XL split, but instead, maybe I'll never see this lineup again. What do you think of this team, Wickd? What do you think? You seem like you were pretty high on the players when they came in.
So, I think the team is really good. I think they need more time together. I don't know how good the coaching staff, if it's bad or not. Maybe it's great. I know it's young buck. But I think this team needs good coaching, and then it needs time, right? It might already have the good coaching, but it didn't have the time. So it's a team with high talent that just haven't meshed together, right? And that's the problem, because they swapped mid-season. If they'd done the swap at the start of the season, I'm pretty confident they would have made it. So it's just a risk you have to take, right? And I think the risk they took, the swapping, was brilliant. It was smart. It was the best move they could do, but it was a bit too late, sadly.
What do you think, Rich?
Yeah, I think what's interesting actually is obviously Markoon, as you said, has been sort of the more hyped of the two and had this player of the games and good performances or whatever. But I actually think Advian is the much bigger upgrade. I think this guy is like, as I think I've said before on a previous show, I think XL's last couple of supports have both been the worst supports in the league when they've been playing. I think they've been absolutely abysmal. And I think a big side effect of Advian joining wasn't just getting a huge upgrade at that specific position, but also I think Patrick has his motivation back. And I said this last time as well, just before or as the changes were being made, that people have talked about maybe Patrick's going downhill a bit or whatever. And I said, obviously, you can never really know for sure. I have to take what he says with a pinch of salt. And again, disclosure, I represent Patrick, so I can be dismissed as slightly biased. But sure. I really felt strongly that it was a motivational issue, and that basically he's been put with the absolute hits in Noscarin in his latter years, not the Noscarin from Rockout, obviously, and Denick, who just looked absolutely atrocious. So I think Patrick's motivation is back. I think you saw that. I think Patrick was playing a lot better. I think obviously Markoon was playing well, but I think Advian was kind of the catalyst that kind of brought that team up. So yeah, I agree that it would have been nice for them, for Joey, for everyone, if they got into LEC. It's just kind of nuts how close they keep getting each time into playoffs. Sorry, but at the same time, would I rather see them in a playoff series than Vitality? Nah, not from a spectator's perspective, at least. So it's like, who do I want to lose out in that sense, and sort of balance it out with, anyone can win it kind of thing. And while I do think XL as Wickd said, can be sort of coached up and they can be a very legitimate team next season, and they are somewhat legitimate now, I don't think they pose a real threat in playoffs. I think Vitality has more upset potential, I would say. So yeah, well, I think it's unfortunate. I'd like to see them play again, but I'm happy with the 6 playoff teams.
Sure. To me, there's like a good and a bad side to this move, like with bringing the players in at the end and all this upgrade. On the one hand, it does show that if you actually just have good pieces, you can get results in theory immediately. Like, you don't have to have built the team up for your months and months, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, there's a reason why the best teams tend to be real cores that didn't make a last-second player change. Because, like, I looked it up here. If you look at the actual amount of time between the first game Markoon played in the LEC and his last game, it's literally just under a month. Like, a month's a pretty short amount of time to be told. You not only have to step up to the top regional level of your entire region, but then on top of that, you have to play against teams. If you look at teams like Rogue, G2, Misfits, they've had their same lineup the whole year. You've just joined any team now. You're still figuring shit out. You're still going through moments that I'm sure are uncomfortable, or the comms are slightly off, or you don't know the hierarchy. In Counter-Strike, we call it the protocols. You don't know who does what at what time, in the order. So, like, you can never take that for granted. I always think, while on the Schalke argument earlier, this was a perfect example of a flip. You'd take this flip all day long, of course. Even if they didn't make it, it was still a better chance. Like, there's a reason why desperation moves are desperation moves. Like, this isn't how you want to make a team, unfortunately. There's one thing I have to say, basically. That's like my final thought, I think, on the XL thing, is this lineup's pretty cool, actually, and has some real potential, whereas in the past, I only ever used to think XL had like 1 or 2 players that looked good, but I don't want to hear the same excuse next year. Like, I don't want to hear next year that they've chopped and changed, taken half of the players out, and then they're like, oh, and we're still working on the team and finding the lineup. It's like, This is like fucking, it's got to be the real lineup eventually. Like, think how many years Youngbuck will have been in the team now when it comes to next year. Like, eventually results must come. Otherwise, I don't care who you are. Like, I always say this. I use the logic that we use in, like, European sports, like football, Rich. My logic goes like this. You can still be an amazing coach. Maybe it's just not this team that's the right team for you, though. You know, so just as in sports, they're pretty ruthless, you know. Even if you're like, I mean, in theory, you could actually be like the third best team, but if you're supposed to win, you might get fired. That's the way it works at the top level. Like, eventually, if results don't come, you have to move on from people. So I have to say, to me, I'm a big fan of Young Buck, but you've got to have some results eventually. There's got to be some playoff runs. There's got to be something, no matter what talent you're working with.
I think you also give or you remove a lot of scope to criticize your career if you do manage to make it work with this team. There have been, they've gone for a few iterations now, and as you say, I'm kind of in the same boat where I'm like, this lineup. I mean, it looks good on paper in terms of what we've seen with our eyes, but also the players and how it's been going. So if you now make a push, and this was the last major change, as you say, to work, then I think he can really sort of vindicate his previous successes, right? Because if we just end his career, let's say that he stays with XL for 2 more seasons and they don't make playoffs in any of those splits, right? A lot of people will look back and say that essentially he was on the 2 best orgs sort of financially in the league, and whoop-de-doo, like you managed to walk behind the path that they created for you and pick up some trophies, right? Will that be fair? Almost certainly not. Will it be a criticism levied against him? Yeah, of course it will. So I think for him personally, if I was him, I'd be really, if over the next, let's say that, they could somehow make Worlds or, reach an LEC final or something like that, that would be massive for him and his career. So yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat with that.
Do you guys know if they're having any roster swaps or not? Like, I think this team cannot have more than 2 roster swaps in this team for the next season or for the off season, right? Because the problem they've been having is they swap around a lot, and the players they have are all extremely talented. I think it could do like 1 player swap maybe, but if they do 2 or more, it's just going to ruin everything again. Because I actually think if they can lock these players down for a longer period of time, I don't know how the contracts work, like how long they are nowadays, or if they just all go up at this end of the season here. But I think he should definitely lock down Advienne, Macoon, and Nuke Dog. I think those 3 will be a great team, regardless of the rest.
I mean, the vibe I get if you listen to like interviews is if like I don't get the sense they necessarily want to make changes. Like Youngbuck rather has bigged up all these players on shows. Mm-hmm. Like he seems to think highly of all of them. So the only one I can think of that is in theory Kris. Like maybe he's someone you consider. I'm not sure. I'm sort of sold on him personally. What were you going to say, Rich?
Yeah, so they have players' contracts coming up. I believe almost all of the contracts are up in November. Kris is up. Patrick is up. Nuke Duck, unless I'm mistaken, is up. I think everyone
except the players who joined and Dan have contracts up this year. Yes.
Yeah. So 3 of the 5 contracts are up. So we'll see. I mean, I expect they want to run it back, but yeah, we'll see. Also, you have to. I mean, as you say, like Kris or whoever, like someone might pick a spot that they perceive to be weak and think, yeah, maybe this guy. But again, you've got to kind of look at the pool and is it an upgrade? Like, who are you going to get? Obviously, Adam moved from ERLs to Fnatic this season. How many other decent pops were there really in the ERLs in the last EU Masters?
Still look pretty good. The problem is, I mean, I've made my thoughts pretty clear on most of the shows with Rogue. I've even told Larson when we had him on on Summoning Insight straight up, like, my problem with Rogue is very simple, and it doesn't affect him at this point in the tournament. It's that I actually do think they're one of those teams. I've seen this happen a lot before. I know they don't want to hear this, but I do think they're chokers. And the reason why I say that is this. I feel like they are the team for real, where if you could turn off the nameplate and they didn't know who they were playing, I don't think there is a single team in the West could actually beat these guys straight up. I think they would wreck everyone. I think they'd even beat some Asian teams. But I tell you what, if you put those nameplates on and they know it's a final and I'm playing against Caps or I'm playing against, mate, these guys, it's not that they will automatically lose because they're really good, but they'll give you chances to win. So my problem is basically, none of that should apply at this point in time. If anything, Misfits have all the way bigger flaws than them in every regard. Like, I think Rogue just wins this. Like, I think they're just a better team and there's no reason you should be super nervous at this point in the tournament. Like, this is exactly when it should be easy to some degree. Like, who wants to start on this one? Who's coming in on this?
So, like, for me, I think Rogue have been the best season the whole season, our best team. I've said that since the beginning. I like, these guys play really clean, they play extremely well, and I don't really think they're going to have the problem of choking. I only think their problem is if they face a team that's on their skill level, but much more aggressive. I think it's the only time they're going to lose. So I think for Misfits to win, they're actually a pretty aggressive team, right? They have to be showing up at an A++ level and actually just beat Rogue down in the individual level. I think that's the only way they're going to win. They have to take constant fights and be extremely aggressive throughout the entire game, because that kind of makes Rogue crumble. But if Rogue just gets this slow-paced game where they take your jungle, they take all the resources, I think Rogue is going to take this extremely clean, and it's probably going to be 3-0 or 3-1. And I don't think it's going to be close unless Misfits really shows up in laning phases and just dominates out of that.
What do you think, Rich?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. I think all of the Rogue laners are too good to get dumpstered in lane enough in a best of 5 to lose the series. I kind of agree with your overarching premise, though, of Rogue, obviously the super clean, methodical early game team who then try and convert that big early lead into a closeout. I think that I agree as well with your idea that you kind of have to make it, excuse me, but sort of chaotic. I think the more chaotic the game is, the more uncomfortable you could potentially make Rogue. I don't believe that Rogue are necessarily chokers, but at the same time, I do semi-subscribe to your point, Thorin, that if the nameplates were turned off, I feel like they would do better. That doesn't mean that I think that they're chokers, yes, but I do think they're somewhat affected by that. And I think you put it quite well where you said they're not going to throw you the game or hand the game over to you, but they might leave gaps or opportunities to win where they shouldn't ordinarily. I'm obviously picking Rogue to win. I think the biggest issue that Rogue have to be aware of is an overconfidence issue, not in terms of their gameplay necessarily, but in terms of how much they want to do and versus how much they want to hide. Because I do think the Rogue have diversified quite a lot this split. Like you've seen Inspired playing towards top, which you didn't even know existed a couple of months ago. You've seen them using a few more picks than they've been using before as well. I'm a bit concerned, or the only concern I would have for Rogue is that they try and keep it really narrow and don't adapt, because they want to try and keep their cards close to their chest for later. And like, I don't think they should see this as a one series like before it's even begun, because I do actually think Misfits is pretty decent. What's really nice about all of these round one games is that all of these teams are pretty decent. I think I don't feel like there's a walkover team in any of these series. So I think if Rogue treats this like a must-win series and doesn't look any further, the old sporting adage of we take it game by game. Well, if you really do take it game by game, then I think Rogue wins. If they're looking at it from a bigger picture perspective and they put the cart before the horse, then I think Misfits is dangerous. But I have to pick Rogue, and I'm picking Rogue to win 3-0 actually, just because I think Rogue will go up early, and I think once it's 2-0, which I expect it to be, I think Misfits will give up basically. So I'm actually going Rogue 3-0, but I do think it has a small amount of upset potential. But those odds are horrendous, so I wouldn't bet on Rogue.
I think one thing we should also talk about is the coaching staff of Rogue, right? Because they have such a clean gameplay, and I don't really think they ever brought up the coaching staff of Freddy and Bloom again. But these guys have done a phenomenal job, in my opinion, at least from what it looks like from an outside perspective, at actually making their players play clean, do what they're supposed to do at the right times, and not be greedy. They're like, oh, I can kill this guy, but the jungle might be here. I'm just going to go for it in YOLO, right?
Sure.
They actually play a clean gameplay where they're thinking about their teammates, they're not greedy, and they're just letting other people carry if they need to carry instead of them, right?
Part of the problem with that thing, by the way, if people don't know, because I know, like, we know them, but obviously publicly people won't really know Freddie 122 because he barely ever does media at all in any context. And if people don't know, even as a pro player, he was a super nerdy. He was literally like an neckbeard. Like, it's like all of us when we were super nerdy back in the day. He was a very quiet guy. So I think that's the problem, Wickd, in my opinion. When you consider his team has won the most games in like 3 straight splits, he doesn't really ever get a mention as like best coach or anything. But that's part of the problem is he doesn't do media basically. So in the same world where everyone complains about like Yamato kind of something, like, well, what do you expect? He's on our screens. We can hear him. We know what he thinks. Like, he can win us over with his personality. He can say ideas that make us believe he did something in the game. The problem with Freddy 122 is we're just having to speculate. Now, I would speculate like Wickd did. If you just look at what his team's done, in fact, if you even add that he changed some of the players and then played almost the opposite playing style, he almost certainly must be doing a good job as a coach. I have to infer that to some degree. And he's kept his team locked in for all these splits in a row. But of course, it's hard to speculate because unfortunately, publicly, people just don't really know the guy.
So I actually think it's completely irrelevant if people do media, because at the end of the day, right, like, or not the public eye, but what they actually bring. Because at the end of the day, you don't know what they actually bring to the team just because they tell you what they bring
of
to
course
the team.
not, yeah.
Because they might bring something completely different. Like, it's really easy if you're good at selling yourself to sell yourself at 150%, even though you're on 100%, right? So I care more about what I actually see on the Rift. And I think Freddy and Bloomhagen needs a lot of praise, even though they haven't gotten it, right? Because they don't do media. They do deserve it. And I think it's somewhat our job to actually pick up on that to some extent.
It's about, obviously, perception versus reality, though, and you have to keep in mind that a lot of not just fans, but also, unfortunately, people who actually get to vote for these things are completely clueless, and they will solely base their opinion on what they see in an interview or whatever. So, unfortunately, that's just the way of the world. I mean, you're describing what would be a logical approach, but people generally don't take that approach. What I would say for Freddie and Bloomhagen or whoever else may or may not be responsible is it does kind of give me sort of Prolly lane swap vibes, what they're doing, in the sense that their real strength is obviously how clean their early game is. And also, I think you can see the sort of footprints of the coaches in the games just by the fact that every single player is conforming to this macro-based style of edging these little gold advantages all over the map until all of a sudden, well, it's 12 minutes in and somehow you're 4K ahead and you haven't got any kills, right? That has to be some kind of coaching. Like, there's no way that bot lane is playing the lane the way they're playing it, top mid seemingly as well, and Inspired doing what he's doing without, creating these dives or whatever, or, one player calling this or that. They are literally getting gold out of thin air, at least to the layman, right? And to me, that's coaching. That requires five players who all have the exact same way of thinking about what they're going to do. So yeah, I can't know for sure. Like, it could just be that as soon as the rod reviews and scrims, they're like, right now that these idiots are out of the room, let's us play a talk about. I mean, obviously that could happen, right? But I think it's much more likely that they're probably doing a pretty good job.
Sure. Yeah, by the way, even though this is a joke, I'll reiterate, it's just a joke. But let's be real. The best jokes always have a seed of truth in them, That was my old joke about our, mutual friend Weldon Greenrich, which is I used to say, because people would go, Thorin, you're too harsh on him. I thought he was pretty good on the episode. And I would be like, no, I get that. Like, that is the gig. That, like, what he just did there on camera, that was it. Like, that it's not what it infers. Like, that's his skill, was to sell you on what he just did in that interview and make you think that he knows loads about the game. So even though it's partly a joke, like, he definitely had some skills beyond that. Like, that my point is basically, it's like what Rich says, it's the perception of what you do as a coach. Like, that's why I say to me, I hate when people like bang on your Marto cannon, because it's like, mate, you're basically just hating on him because he's just very well presented. He just knows how to talk. Like, that can't be a reason to hate on a guy. Like, so because you can't connect that to what you think he might be doing in the server, that makes him fake. No. Either way, that if people are young men, by the way, you've got to get out of that mentality. Because I had that when I was very young in my career. What you're basically doing there, no joke, is you're just being envious, essentially. What you're doing is you're looking at someone and going, they have a skill I don't have. So in this case, maybe they're really good on camera, charismatic. So what you do is, instead of just going, well, they have a skill I don't have, you just go, that skill's not important. And so it's actually, you're even fake if you do that. You're pretending to be somewhat great. You're not. That's like I'll just say it right now, that's a very immature take to have. Like, it's actually a skill set everyone should work on, including people who do shows like this. That's why some people are good, some people are rubbish. But enough about when Doublelift, Sneaky, and Meteos tried to figure out the infinite monkey theorem. Look it up on YouTube. One of the funniest videos you'll ever see in your entire life. You should look it up, Wickd. Like, you would cry laughing, mate. It's
what
so
is that
funny.
even?
Basically, without making a whole tangent, right? When they do those core streams, Doublelift, when he was doing his, and he does it with Meteos and Sneaky, right? He brings up that famous example, which is supposed to be, it's a thought exercise to explain the premise of infinity. And what you say, Wickd, is, you'll have heard it before. You say, if I was to take an infinite number of monkeys with an infinite number of typewriters, and they have an infinite amount of time and attempts, then even if they're just bashing away on any key, because they have an infinite amount and an infinite time, eventually one of them, by accident, essentially without it being willed, will famously, they say, will have typed the entire works of Shakespeare correctly, like from begin to end. Now, the point of it is, it's if you can just understand the premise of what infinity is, it's not just a lot, it's literally you've got as many as you need. We keep going, right? The problem is, basically, like, Sneaky, at least on camera, couldn't even begin to approach that premise. That was like a fucking black hole that he couldn't even get past the Event Horizon of. Like, he just kept saying, like, but they wouldn't do it in order, you know, like how would they get the, like he kept saying all the like NPC, all the fucking super NPC, like basically the sort of shit that someone says when they first hear that before they've actually thought it through. But the problem is he's saying this all on camera, like I'm just sat there like this is so embarrassing. And then between the three of them, this is maybe a statement about American culture. Doublelift, who brought up the premise and at least initially seemed to half understand it, it's almost like trying to explain it to them made him understand it less, and he sort of lost it by the end of it. Like it's really like it's almost like worth watching just as like an exercise in anthropology. It's like nothing to do with the actual like Infinity or the game, but like just go look it up. I'll maybe I'll link it in the description of this for people who want to laugh. It's funny as fuck, right? So one thing I have to ask is this: on the Misfits side of this playoff matchup, actually, here's what's interesting. When we had Dylan Falco on Summoning Insight, he basically said, it might be the Crackdown, he basically said that actually pro players don't have the take that I have on Rogue at all, of like, you know, they might choke or maybe they're going to have problems. Apparently, the pros and the other people in the like LEC behind the scenes, they just think flat out Rogue is just the best and that they're going to win. Like, you know, like all markers are up, everything's great, there's no problems. So, interestingly enough, that would mean most people would also agree with these odds. They'd have Misfits as like a heavy underdog, probably not going to win this. I'd assume most people probably don't have them going to Worlds. What you give them a chance here, Wickd. Like, is it just Rogue as an opponent? Like, do they actually have a chance to do something in the playoffs beyond this matchup? Are they going to lose this matchup, though?
I think they're going to lose this matchup, right? But I think Misfits is a really good team. I would say they're top 4 right now. And I think Misfits have pretty good chances to make Worlds, so I don't really see why they wouldn't have. G2 is kind of coin flippy right now. Mad Lions is extremely coin flippy. Misfits also coin flippy. And then you have Fnatic, which is coin flippy, and I think Vitality is kind of bad. So I think those 4 teams all have a chance to make it. Then Vitality is probably not going to make it. I don't even think they're a real team because they seem to have the wrong personalities to actually make a team. I don't know, but that's what I think, right? So I think Rogue is guaranteed to make it in my eyes, and then the rest is just going to fight for it, the rest of the 4, and Vitality will fail.
What about you, Rich? Where do you have Misfits' trajectory?
Yeah, it's kind of similar in that I think Rogue is a really bad matchup for them, but I feel like they hypothetically could beat any of the other teams. In a weird way, it's like trying to do like, you know, boxing or MMA maths, right? Like it doesn't necessarily quite work out in a sort of seamless connected dots way, in the sense that I would not be that surprised, for example, if Mad Lions were to beat Rogue in another best of 5, right? Like I wouldn't be that shocked. But similarly, I think I would probably have Misfits favored over Mad Lions if they played a best of 5, or at least it would be very close in my estimation. Okay. So yeah, it really is a case of like everyone can beat everyone apart from a bunch of teams can't beat Rogue would be the best way I would describe it. But there are still a couple of teams who I think would stand a chance against Rogue. But yeah, I think Misfits are just very much in the mix. I wouldn't necessarily apply a number next to their name because I think there are some matchups where I feel more confident than others, but that doesn't necessarily mean the team that I think could beat them is higher than them on the ladder, right? If that makes sense. So yeah, I think they're good, but I just think this is a bad matchup. But could they beat Fnatic? Yeah, I think they could. Probably wouldn't favor them. Could they be Mad? Yeah, I would actually favor Misfits just because of that specific matchup. But I think Mad maybe have better matchups against other teams. So yeah, it's a bit of a cesspool of who beats who after you go.
Potential for Mad Lions on this one?
I still have a image now in my head of Doublelift trying to explain to Sneaky how a hard drive weighs the same when it's full or not. Yeah, I actually think this is like a 50-50 game. I think this is a complete pick'em. I think there's obviously like previous BO5 precedents for Mad beating G2, right? So
true.
I don't know. I think what's really interesting about this game, kind of like a sort of wild factor to this, is top lane. I think top lane is super interesting because obviously on the one hand you have Wonder, who you'd have to say overall like all or most of the year hasn't looked quite like his old self. And then on the flip side you've got Armu, who obviously has, you know, he's a decent top laner in spurts, but also has, you know, very obvious weaknesses. And now they've brought in Vizichachi to help top lane, which I find very strange because to me, Vizichachi has the exact same weaknesses or had the exact same weaknesses as the player as Armu did, or at least very similar.
Yes. Yeah.
But I'd say Vizichachi was a better version of Armu, essentially, when he was sort of in his pomp. So I'm not really sure that's going to change anything, because unless Vizichachi has enough self-awareness to know what his, you know, how, you know, bad his overextending was and certain other aspects he was doing, it's a strange one. But in a weird way, I could also see that, going the opposite way, and actually maybe because of that, it'll be really helpful to Armut. So I don't know. To me, that's kind of like the key lane to look at in that matchup. I so far as any matchup, in the West in playoffs so far, like I think this is a complete coin flip 50-50. I would actually I want to bet on Mad. If I was going to make a bet, just because of the odds seem to favor G2, I would definitely bet on Mad because I do think it's a complete 50-50. But I would make G2 maybe 51-49 favorites or something. Like I think it's a complete flip. Oh, keep in mind as well that G2, I think they've won their last 5 games, and that's including a BO1 win over Mad and also Misfits, I'm pretty sure. So they went on a bit of a run and beat some pretty decent teams who they're likely to face in playoffs at the end. And we always spoke about, for G2, with the kind of players that they have, it's about peaking at the right time rather than being really good all the way through. So it could be the case that G2 have actually just are about to peak and hit their stride. And I think what you might see in this series is either a very close back and forth series, which Mad might nag or G2 might nag, or you see G2 plow through Mad, and by the end of the series, we're thinking, oh, actually, they're favourites to win LEC. So, yeah, I think one of those two scenarios is pretty likely.
I think it's mostly going to come down to if Wunder is coin flipper, if he's going to play well. Because I think in the other roles, I think G2 is just better all around everywhere, unless Caps goes full coin flip, which he does sometimes, but mostly not. I just think they're a stronger team of all. I think Mad Lions is weak in every single role, but top potentially. And I think Vici bringing him in is actually really, really smart because both of them are extremely aggressive players, but I think Vici is a little bit more passive than Armut, which will actually help him understand that playstyle a little bit better because he's extremely good at playing aggressive, not so good at playing passive. Vici is a little bit better there. So I think that's really smart. I think it's good to focus on top lane because that's where you're dominating compared to G2 if Wunder isn't on top form. And I mean, I think it comes down to Wunder. If Wunder performs, I think G2 wins. And if he doesn't perform well, then I actually think G2 will lose this one.
I think you characterised it well there, Rich, which I definitely agree. To me, there's 2 scenarios. One, which is why I understand why the predictions team actually had Mad Lions winning. They win, like, an epic close series where, as you say, it's like a fucking mad war of attrition and chaotic match. Or G2, I think, just turns up and smashes them. I think one of the two, in my opinion. So basically, I think it's on G2. It's like, how well have they got their shit together? And quite frankly, I know it's best of ones, which I always do think. That's an area I've noticed in League. I know you guys don't have many tournaments, so it's hard not to do it, basically. But that's one thing, if people want like a little bit of inside info, in Counter-Strike, I and a couple of the other top analysts, we don't actually do like in-tournament form as the main factor as to how you predict teams. We actually tend to subscribe to like the first principles philosophy. So my logic goes like this. Once the playoffs begins, I just look at the teams and what fundamental factors they have, like playing style, player strength. Now, obviously, I have to like do individual form in terms of like how good the player is now, but I don't, for example, go mental for like, 2 weeks ago they lost the best of one to this team, so that team's favoured. I think that's like sort of incidental. It's more like confidence, in my opinion, that works for. It doesn't really affect like a best of 5 series too much. So I personally think it's more about like, is G2 actually like as good as the names look? They actually look like they're almost there from the end of the split. They look like somehow, I know it seems cliched because like the idea that like the team with all the good players just peaks right towards the playoffs is sort of what in Europe's always been the case with G2, Fnatic teams going back years. But they did it. They've actually done it this split. Like I genuinely think I actually think if my rogue theory applies in the short, I think G2 is going to win the split. I've come round completely because if you'd have caught me, I'm going to say like middle of the summer split, dude, I didn't even know if G2 was going to Worlds then. That looked fucking rough. Anyone have any thought? Who thinks does anyone actually have them winning? Does everyone else have Rogue winning the split?
I actually think the Rogue is a bad matchup for G2. I actually watched back, or not in its totality, but I actually watched the best of 5 that they played last split, where Rogue won 3-1. And again, it's not exactly the same. G2 aren't going to come into this playoffs in exactly the same mode or whatever that they did then. But Rogue did just look better. Like, I do think in terms of like their absolute peak possible performances, you can definitely make arguments that G2 is a better team when everyone's like on their absolute A game. I think the problem is that when players reset back towards their norms, that the norms for Rogue players are just higher than the norms for G2 players.
Right.
I think Otto over Wunder for sure. I think Inspired over Jankos, even though you can argue that Jankos can potentially have higher peaks. I guess same for top lane, maybe, kind of. Mid lane, again, like Caps, obviously if Caps is on song, he's better than Larson, but I think that Larson's norm right now, I would trust more at least. And then, AD carry's a bit of a wash, I guess, but I just think Hands works better as an AD carry in the context of his team. That doesn't mean he's better than Reckless, but I think he has been one of the best AD carries this split for sure. And I think he works better with his team than Reckless works with his team. And then Trimby as well. I think Trimby's been really good. I wouldn't say that Mickey X has been better than him. So I just feel like across the board that I actually just trust Rogue's sort of net neutral level more than I trust G2's. Obviously, if G2 show up in any kind of like 2019 form or whatever, then of course they're going to win. But I don't believe that. I think G2 are a bit better than they were last split. But I think that if they play Rogue, and they won't necessarily play Rogue, right? But if they do play Rogue, I think Rogue wins.
Fair enough.
I think Rogue is probably favored to win, and they should be winning that matchup, but there's decent chances for G2 to actually win this split. But I don't really think it matters in the grand scheme of things. I think most LEC teams are mostly just focused on actually getting to Worlds and winning Worlds, right? And actually trying to finally do something internationally and win the World Championship. I think sending both Rogue and G2 will be amazing for our region because they both have extremely good peaks, but completely different strengths, right? So depending on the meta that's good at Worlds, we will be sending two teams that might excel in different metas depending on what Riot is doing. So I think I want both these teams to go, and I don't really care who the third team is because I think these two teams could both potentially make it to a finals at Worlds.
I think that what you said is true for G2. I think that G2 will care way more, if they feel that there's a path towards potentially winning Worlds. Of course, that's like on G2's dartboard, right? I think for Rogue, though, actually winning LEC would be pretty important. One, because of what Thorin said earlier, where, again, I don't subscribe to the view that they're necessarily chokers, but I do think mentally it would be huge for them if they win LEC and have, closed out something where they didn't, let it, litter away like it did last split or whatever. I think that'll actually be big for their confidence going into Worlds. And also keep in mind, everyone on G2's won a trillion trophies, right? Most of these players on Rogue haven't won anything. So I do, including Otto, right? Which seems crazy to say, but, even for him, I think it would be a huge confidence boost. So I think Rogue winning LEC would be huge for their chances at Worlds. Actually. For G2, I don't think it would make too much difference. But no, I think it'd be big if Rogue did.
I think there's also a factor for Rogue that's way bigger, which is because of the way they lost that spring final. It's almost like a gambler. Like in your mind, you're owed one. You're supposed to win that one just to get it back, as it were. Because if people don't remember, the way they lost that series was about the least satisfying way you could ever lose. They were 2-0 up, then they were leading in the third game. Then the drafts were looking basically that's you would feel so cheated if you lost that way. So I would hope if you're a true pro, what you're supposed to do really is just imagine no season exists except this one and just play this one out, and if you're the better team you win. But it's put it this way, those narratives, they do get in people's heads. Put it this way, when we were having Odo Amne on, I think it was Summoning Insight, and I was sort of lightly ribbing him about that because I've known him a long time, dude. It was one of those ones where I could tell even when they laugh for that one, you have sort of touched the wound a little bit, yeah, of course it fucks with someone if they've never even been in a final after all those years. Then you make the final and everyone's telling you it's your time, you've just beaten G2, you're the best, it's your, I always say the most dangerous final, I have this term, right? The most dangerous final in esports is the one where on paper, one team's supposed to win, and so it's just viewed as a coronation. Because the amount of times that while they're sort of just waiting for someone to put the crown on them, the other team just runs up and just steals it is mental. It happens so many times. If people don't know, probably the most famous CSGO match ever is exactly that storyline. When Cloud9 won the Boston Major, they weren't supposed to. Literally, FaZe Clan was supposed to win that tournament, and nearly every player on FaZe Clan was a legendary player who hadn't won the major, and it was supposed to all be right, well done, everyone get ready to win the tournament. And in doing so, when they thought they would cruise through this match, the underdog just beat them narrowly because that it takes all the pressure off the underdog in that setting. So I just hope for Rogue that, I say, I hope they do buy into the idea that they're not chokers and you forget about the last ones and it's a new split and all that. It's just, unfortunately, I have noticed patterns do tend to play out over and over again in these games. You get put in the same scenarios over and over again. It's why, if you notice, I'm one of the people who's one of the last people to be out on Perkz, because it's mate, I'm not going to fucking bail on the most clutch player ever, before it's even over. Have you never seen a fucking movie? You know what? LCS fans are those people who are oh, right, oh no, I heard a gunfire and then the camera cut away, so I guess that villain's dead. Right, well, the movie's ended now. Wow, he's going to go and meet his family. Like, what the hell? A guy with an axe behind him. It's like, have you never seen a movie before? Like, till you see the body, you ain't over, is it? So, till I see Perkz' whatever, $11 million body just swirling around the fucking drain, I'm not giving up. I'm staying in on him. I'm even in on people who don't even play League of Legends, like fucking Soaz, where it's like, even they're not fighting their own corner anymore. I'm like, is everyone going to give Soaz a job? And he's like, I don't even want one. It's like, shut up, you're good, you're still good, damn it. And Froggen, you have to play as well.
Number one fanboy.
I do, low key. So you know what's sad, actually? People think I'm trolling. I actually would consider, like, those are the only teams I ever would have considered coaching, is the teams that had players like that. And we're basically low key. I just think no one ever did, like, the right team around them or whatever. Right, let's move to the last matchup then, okay? So for this one, I'm actually going to save it. And whereas on the other two, I told you straight up where I was at, where I was betting, because nothing was going to change my mind. I'll be totally honest with you. I actually think this Fnatic Vitality series, every time I think about it, I can go a different way on who wins, how it plays out, whether it's an easy match, whether it's a hard match. Like, dude, I feel like this match has all possibilities in it. So I actually want to hear what you guys think. I'm just going to try at the end and fucking like crowdsource an answer. So do you want to start on this one, Rich? Where are we going on this one? Because I have to feel like this is a really tough one to analyse.
Yeah, I mean, so here's the thing. I'm kind of in a similar place in the meat of it, but I always end up at the same result, which is I think Fnatic will win. The bottom line is I feel that I can't trust Vitality in a best of 5. I don't think Vitality has it in them yet to be consistent enough to win 3 games out of 5. I think Vitality could probably beat literally any team in the world in a best of 1 on their day, right? If people are all playing well. But I just don't think in a best of 5 that I trust them. And I think that the issue is, like, the other thing is I don't see this being a sweep. Like, I think Vitality will win a game for sure. I even think that Vitality 50-50, they'll win 2 games. I just don't see it in them to win 3 out of 5 against Fnatic. I think that, you know, Vitality won. I think in the last Super Week, Vitality went 3-0 and they beat Rogue as well, which, you know, some people are pointing at and saying that legitimizes that run. And it does to a certain extent. But at the same time, basically, Rogue had 2 chances to lock in first. And the second one was against SK. So it was as dead a game for them as it could have been, really. That doesn't necessarily take much away from the win, but it kind of does at the same time. So I don't know. I think Vitality, in a mini way to G2, they're kind of peaking so far as in the context of the split, at least at the end, coming into playoffs. But I don't think they're there yet. I think, again, if you've given this team like another month of regular season games and a bunch of scrimming, I think this could, you know, be in the position that the Mad G2 game's in, where it's like kind of coin flip. I don't really know which way it's going to go. But no matter how I play out the scenario, and keep in mind, I kind of would rather have Vitality win than Fnatic, I can't make it work in my head. So I have Fnatic winning. I think 3-1 or 3-2 is the most likely scenario, but probably 3-1 if I had to pick.
Wickd surely is going heavily for Fnatic here based on your opinions over the split.
So I believe Fnatic is 2-0 against Vitality this split as well. I think Fnatic is a lot better than Vitality. I think Fnatic will win this pretty cleanly, 3-1. I think if Vitality makes a miracle and actually wins against Fnatic, they're just going to get stomped against the next team. I don't think they're good enough to actually make the top 3. I just don't see them there. And I disagree with the point you made earlier if you give them another month. I think the more time you give Vitality, the worse they're going to get in comparison to other teams. So I actually think they're on a downhill slope instead of an uphill slope, right? And I know they did win recently, but I just don't really see, with the personalities that I can tell from outside, that this team is going to become one of the best teams, right? Given more time. I just don't see it. I would make swaps.
I mean, the thing is, it's not about becoming one of the best teams necessarily. Like, at least I'm kind of looking at this series in isolation, and I think there's enough volatility in Fnatic and their own play style. And obviously that's matched and then some by Vitality. But I think you have to keep in mind that this team is, sure, they have big egos and they might clash and, you know, you want them to peak at the right time or whatever. But I do think if they had more time together, they would be a better team and they would be more consistent. Would that be enough to win this series or win LEC or whatever? I have no idea. Do I think Vitality would ever beat a team like Rogue as currently constructed in a best of 5? No, I don't. But I do think they are like the ultimate wild card here. I just think it's come like a touch too soon. And while I don't put like loads of stock in regular season BO1s, I do think it is telling that they played, they went 3-0 in their last 3 games. All of these games were must wins, right? They were like backs against the wall to make playoffs. It was Excel, them, and Astralis. They beat Astralis to get into playoffs, essentially. They beat Rogue, where, again, the stakes for Rogue were not as high as they could have been, but still, they beat Rogue. And I believe the other game was SK or something like that. But I think that they've shown enough to be very interesting. I don't have them favored, and I don't think they're going to win this series, but I don't think Vitality are bad at all. As I said, I literally think this could be any team in the world in the best of 1. I just don't think, with their kind of dice roll play style, that they're going to land on 6 3 times out of 5. I just think that's a bit far gone.
Don't you think that Fnatic would get better faster at a faster rate than Vitality? Because they have Breepo in the jungle, who's kind of new to the jungle, right? He needs more experience. And they have Adam in the top, who also needs more experience. He's playing extremely well, but I think he's going to get even better over the time, right? So I think this team is going to accelerate much faster than Vitality is. And I would actually say that Fnatic is going to get better over time here.
I think you can flip. I think you can kind of turn that arguments against you, though, look at Leader, right? Like, the more time that Leader's going to play against LEC level scrims, like week in, week out, he's arguably the biggest talent on either team. Self-made, like while Bwipo might, improve in jungle, I think that would be fair to say that the more he plays jungle, probably the better he's going to get at it. If Self-made has any kind of a semblance of his peak form, he is almost certainly going to be a better jungler than Bwipo at any point of Bwipo's trajectory playing jungle. So while what you say I don't disagree with, I think you can apply the same logic to Vitality, and I think Vitality comes out.
But I think the rest of the Fnatic players are already solid, right? Where I think those are kind of like the ones that needs more time. But if I look at Vitality, I wouldn't say the same in comparison to those two key teams, right?
I think Labrob and Crownshot are pretty damn good bot lane on paper. Obviously Upset and Hylissang as well. But then again, you have the sort of explosive elements of like Hylissang. You don't necessarily know which one you're going to get in the same way that you don't necessarily know which leader you're going to get game to game. So I don't know. I think this is like a dream matchup spectator-wise, or at least has the potential to be. But it could also, I agree, this could be a 3-0 Fnatic. Like, I wouldn't be amazed if it was, but I also think it could
up, in my opinion, to this match. Right, realistically, even if they win this matchup, right, odds are Vitality's not being the team that's going to Worlds. They'd have to keep winning matches to even get there, right? The question for me, which is more interesting, it's kind of like what you were talking about there, but I'd extend it, is the weird way the team was set up was that Selfmade's contract actually ends at the end of the year. He was a one-split player, essentially. They already have removed the SLT guy and put Segenda back in, and they claim, maybe the other guy can come back when he learns whatever they say, like how to play the game they want or not. So, but my question is this. I think the hypothetical that's more interesting is, do you think this team even exists next year? Like, Rich, do you think they just like cut it in half, keep 1 player, 2 player? Like, because I could see it going all possibilities. I'm not even that sure myself if this is the plan to keep the squad. I don't know.
Obviously the main people who you would expect, at least player wise, to hold the cards would be Leader and Selfmade, in the sense that they're, in theory, the 2 most volatile. And they would have you believe publicly that they're best buddies, right? Like,
they almost feels like they oversell that, doesn't it?
Yeah,
they almost go, what I mean?
It's a bit. It's like, to me, it's so on the nose that you wouldn't be surprised that if like it comes out a month after they go to 2 different teams, and then the first opportunity one gets like that little fuck. You actually wouldn't be that surprised. Like, I could see that happening. So it's on those 2 really. Obviously, as a fan, like I'd love to see I'd like to see the same team come back, but with a fucking good top laner. That would be the dream, right? Because I don't think either Segenda or SLT are particularly good at all. But I guess the actual dream would be, and it's not going to happen, but would be Otto on Vitality with that lineup, because someone who is actually really good but could play weak side. So yeah, I don't know. My guess would be that it splits up, that it breaks up. That would be my guess. I just think that probably behind the smile are 2 crying men in the form of Selfmade and Leader. So yeah, I would imagine that probably they're overcompensating. But again, that's pure conjecture and speculation. I have no basis for that whatsoever, other than, as you said to me, they're overplaying it. But I'd love to see them come back and run it back.
Because that is one thing that we all do it in the community. We are a bit feckless ourselves, which is because we all love the fact that idiots on the internet don't really know all the details of the behind the scenes stuff, and usually Reddit's wrong and all that jazz. We all do also over-egg the pudding of how wrong they are. Because basically what you're talking about here, Rich, is that obviously the precedent was set of self-made's supposed to be toxic and so's leader, so imagine how toxic they're going to be together, it's going to blow up. So it is almost like they were going out of their way from day one to be like, no, this is my friend, haha, toxic, what? Which is now you've gone too far the other way. That's like back in the day when they do the same thing. Look, just because they can sometimes be wrong in how they characterize it. I'll give you an example we used on this show. Say Forgiven was lol, doing that fucking shit period, the 2 years where people put that SpongeBob meme of the bird talk or whatever, where you just put all the capitalization. Be like, so I am the toxic. It's I just even would say to them bro, you are pretty toxic. Listen, just because they don't know in what way, you are, obviously, let's not pretend the entire thing's manufactured. It's not like a mirage in the desert, is it? There is some basis to this. People definitely overblow that angle. And let's be real, that is the main factor as well, Rich, because the problem is, those are the two players that you obviously want to stay and you want to see them build the team around. They even both have kind of the same story. It's everyone knows the fucking talent these guys have, but there's just some that has not connected with them, with teammates, or it almost feels satisfied if they can do it together, which doesn't necessarily work out, but I get the premise. Wickd, where are you coming on this one, mate? You think they keep the squad together?
I don't think they keep the squad together as 5, and I don't think they should. I mean, they already changed top lane at once, right? The chance of them changing top lane again is pretty high. I just don't really like the playstyles. I think the playstyles clashes in that team, and I don't really think it's great to have those players all together. Not necessarily that all the players are bad or anything. I think the players are pretty good in that team. I just don't really like how they work together as different playstyles, right? I think they need more passive laners, bot lane, for example, a little bit more passive, a little bit more versatile, and they need different top laners, obviously, because they're always swapping around all the time. It's not a good look, and it seems like a blame game where it's top lanes fall, swap around, and it just doesn't really work. But back to your point earlier that you're betting on Vitality, right? So these are my things. I'm actually considering betting on Vitality during the game as well. I think for Vitality to win, I think if Nisqy picks Akali, that's a really big plus for Vitality. I think Nisqy's not very good in Akali, and there's a high chance that leader will stomp him, and Akali becomes completely useless, so it's kind of like a 5v4. And then also, I think Selfmade is obviously really good if he peaks and plays really well, and he early invades Breepo, just like Inspired did earlier in the season, right? Where Inspired early invaded Breepo, and Breepo was completely useless and didn't do anything the entire game, right? That's a really good way for Vitality to win as well. So if there's a super aggressive matchup in the jungle, I think that's a plus, and I think Vitality can win those kind of games. So it's definitely interesting.
By the way, obviously, it's also the awards season because those always happen at the beginning of the playoffs. I also wanted to just get people's thoughts on that. Rich, who would your MVP be for the LEC? Who would you pick out?
It's got to be Razork, I think. Despite Misfits' second half of the split not being quite as good, they didn't fall off as hard as they definitely could have. And I just feel that this guy was just levels above people in the first half of the split and remained good throughout. So I think Inspired kind of had a really good consistent split, I would say. And he'd be close as well. Obviously, those are two junglers, but I think Razork has to be the standout for me, for sure. Who
do you have, Wickd? Who would you pick?
Honestly, I hate MVP roles because I feel like they're completely worthless. I'd probably pick Adam due to the situation he came in and how he's performed due to that situation.
Oh, come on.
Is the MVP of the whole league?
Come on, MVP, not rookie of the split.
Is this a bit? I know, is this a bit?
No, it's
come
not
on,
rookie of the split, but due to the entire situation and also him not getting very much help when he played games, he still managed to get the most kills, solo kills, right? While also playing 1v2. I think this guy performed extremely well. And I know you disagree, it's very clear. But I hate MVP awards. I think they're absolute trash. I think if you actually want to do a good MVP award, you have to watch every game from the start and focus on that specifically, which nobody does. I just think nobody's really qualified to give this reward, and I think it's a useless reward.
Listen, I don't disagree with some of the questions about how it's done. I'll give you an obvious example. I literally years ago did Thorin's thoughts complain about the way they did the all LEC or all LCS voting or whatever. But I actually, sadly, this is the black pill. I actually realised there's no point complaining about it much more, aside from the odd time, because it's going to be the same every single split, and it has been. Which is basically the problem is, for example, media also gets to vote on all these awards. And if you ever go and look, I'm not joking, there are always two types of media. there is one type of media where, no joke, it's someone who just doesn't follow the space, and so they just vote for ridiculous people. And the worst one, I can't even believe this still exists, but it does, is they will let literally biased media. So the example I always give is last split in the LCS, they let a guy who was from some, like, I believe it was some, like, Latin America, like Mexico or something. They took some, like, guy from a Mexican outlet, and what he did was he voted anyone who was, like, in any way Latin American, like, into all the roles. So he voted, like, the Jose Diodo and the newbie guy from, like, FlyQuest or whatever. Yeah, he put them in, like, top 3 in their roles. And even when I went to his Twitter account, because to me, I'm, like, the fucking... Why am I, like, the fucking PI in a fucking film noir and everyone else is just some corrupt fuck? And I'm having to, like, beat... Like, and then I followed him to his hideout and felt like, well, I don't know why I'm doing any of this, but I did, because I'm a nutter for some reason. So I looked it up and I went on his Twitter, and I even found him on his Twitter, unironically, tweeting at one of the aforementioned, like, Latin American players, something in Spanish, which when I translated it was the equivalent of, like, I've always got your back, bro. It's like, I'm just sat there like, is this real life? Like, it's just like, where's the candid camera? Like, this can't be real. This guy's literally got the vote. He's even essentially telling you, like, I just vote for my friends who, if they come from my region of the world, like, so I agree, mate. Here's the thing, Wickd. Whether or not you think someone's the MVP, you can't be letting people like that be the ones that decide it. Like, they're not going to do it based on any of the factors to do with the game. Like, I agree with your premise. Like, here's the problem, right? In theory, Riot already has built in with the All LEC, like, the real thing that you should have. Mm-hmm. The ideal thing in an ideal world would be every pro player just takes it seriously and really puts the top 3 for each role, but assuming they can't vote for their own teammates, you know, out of everyone in the league. If everyone did that, I would somewhat trust the results. Like, you know, there might be one that's a bit off. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, maybe some other player agrees with Wickd and they have, like, Adam higher than I would. The difference is this. There's never going to be a world where, like, the idiot media guy, someone would, like, that would be the equivalent of someone picking, like, you know, fucking, like, Genax as the best top laner in the league. Mm-hmm. So it's like, there's no good reason you could do that. Like, we can have subjective opinions, but that's almost objectively wrong. Like, you'd have to have some really crazy angle to make that right, in my opinion. So I do think, like, overall the premise is sort of a waste of time because they don't do it properly, but I do think you could get fairly close. Like, I would love to know, for example, like I said, I would love to know, like, who all the mid laners think the best mid laner is. Like, do they really still think it's Caps, or do people think it's humanoid now? I'd actually love to know, just, like, sort of the temperature test. Just unfortunately, you can't really trust them to do it because most players seem to just half troll, you know.
Yeah, I think as well, the removal of Pro View kind of made this more difficult. So, like Wickid's point where he says, like, oh, you'd have to watch the game from the start with the view of thinking, like, who's putting in. Like, if you have Pro View, that becomes a lot easier, right? Because you actually get to see, like, top laning phase played out in its entirety, which you're never going to see on the Riot broadcast at all. I'm also curious, do Riot broadcast people still get votes? Because
as far as I know, they do.
I think they do, because something that I found curious, I got, like...
I believe even, like, for example, the interviewers get the vote as well.
Okay, because I got a lot of heat for saying something which I didn't think was particularly controversial at all. That I just said that, you know, Troublelink, one of the newer casters, you know, someone who I don't really have any issue with at all, but they were commentating a game that SK were playing. And I just thought... Well,
they work with them, of course.
Yes. Yeah, I just thought it was pretty weird that you get to cast games that for a team who literally pay your paychecks. And yes. I have zero issue with her casting an LEC or casting even non-SK games, even if the games have ramifications which affect SK, which are a conflict of interest. But I would say that they're probably mild enough that I'd be fine with it. I just thought it was a little bit strange that she literally gets to cast a team that she's paid for. But similarly, if she gets a vote, for, you know, players of the season, again, it's not the end of the world. Like, at the end of the day, I don't put much stock in these things either, but I think that's sad, and I would like to see it go in a direction where it is taken more seriously. But if someone who works for a team gets to vote for someone in SK, for example, I think that's pretty ridiculous. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, as you say, I think the idea that the media just arbitrarily are given as equal a say as players who play against the other players, I find that completely bizarre. But I think the whole thing needs an overhaul to be taken seriously anyway. I mean, it's the same with the all-pro voting. Now I'm pretty sure the all-pro vote, didn't they make it a community vote or something outrageous?
I think fans vote now, yeah. Because if you remember in spring, they just voted all of G2.
Yeah, it's just outrageously meaningless. Like, it's complete farce. And the fact that if they want to do that and have it as a fun aside thing, firstly, that's really sad in my opinion, because you just completely wash all historical archiving and reference points going forward. Because first of all, you went from a position where it was at least somewhat legitimately voted for before that, and unless someone really goes neck deep, they're not actually going to see where the cutoff point was. But also, it just becomes completely ridiculous, and unless you sort of package it as some fun little fan decide thing, again, people aren't going to realize that. And they're like, wow, G2 didn't even win the split. And all 5 players are like, all pro first team. So I don't know. I think they should. I thought that was a terrible decision anyway to go in that direction. But I think they should just revamp it and fine tune it and just make it a lot more or as close to objective as it can be, because I think it's just really sad that they're basically destroying any real chance that someone who wasn't previously watching the scene can come into the scene and research it.
That's the key part of what he says there as well. It's like, it's the fact that like you can have a historical record if you didn't watch the games, because just like any sport, like if I go and look in like European soccer, who won like the Ballon d'Or, I've got to at least believe, assuming it's not a totally corrupt process, that was one of the absolute best players and probably at least like a debatable, if not the actual best player. When most years, they do a fairly good job with that sort of thing. Meanwhile, you go and you look at league and games in esports where you have these like wacky methods. Dude, we're so all over the place. I'll give you an example. Here's a contrast, a thought exercise for you. If I told you, this is all true, factual, that Vizi was a European LCS MVP, but Jensen has never won the NALCS MVP, right? The implication from that would be, oh, well, the 2 players, like, it must have been Vizi was like, the first ballot Hall of Famer, like one of the best players ever. Jensen, he must have just been like a good player. Like that, you got exactly the wrong characterization completely of those 2 careers. One was a journeyman who was a pretty good above average player. That's Vizi. And then the other one, Jensen, was one of the absolute best players in the entire region for like fucking half a decade or something mental. So you can sit same with if people don't know, another one that's mental, Doublelift's only won the MVP 1 time. The guy's won the most fucking championships of anyone ever to play in the region across like 3 different organisations. Like, holy shit, you're either saying you just don't think he tries in the regular season, or this is a fundamentally broken system. Like, how can he have as many MVPs as Arrow? Like, something's going wrong here, boys,
But that's not what I'm talking about, right? I think the people doing them are not qualified. I don't think I'm qualified. I'm pretty good at the game, right? And I watched every single game. I don't think I'm qualified to do it. I think the only people that are qualified to do it, I was going to recommend as well, but you did it earlier, is the players. It's only the players, and maybe the coaches could also do it, right? And that's it. Everyone else is really not qualified, because I just think when you're in there and you're playing the games, you get a different feel for every single player, right?
Of course.
Then you're watching games, even though I was a previous pro player, I don't get the same feel. I don't know how it feels to play against them, play with them, and so on, right? So it's completely different. And I can't tell how good players really are in those games to the same level as if I played against them.
Also, by the way, here's one of the reasons why, even though I like rib him on this show, I never actually dismiss like Wicked's take that like Adam's the best top laner or like one of the best. Because here's the thing, I know that like Wickd might be looking at different things than me, or maybe he's been like in certain cases, obviously, sometimes he's played literally against these players. Because I tell you what, there's always players where if you know the behind the scenes opinion, there are some that have like really big mismatch. Like a classic one to me was actually Nukeduck a few years ago, right? If you go back for fans, they think Nukeduck was only good, like fucking 5 years ago or something. But if you go back to basically when he was on Schalke and then like the early Origin days, dude, if you talk to actual other mid laners in Europe, they have this guy mega high. They think he's like a fucking like, they make him sound like some fucking like anime character, like a sage type guy who's like an old wise guy who just, is wily, always knows how to play, always has it. You can never sort of get ahead of him. Then you would look at fans and they would just be like, hey, he's just average and he's just okay. It's like, that just shows that like when you actually play him, he must seem way smarter than whatever they're seeing on the camera, as it were, There's definitely a level you can't understand. You can't like make up for the experience of playing them. I would agree. That seems like it seems like the ultimate factor, really. It's basically the eye test times 10, isn't it?
I think there's like a huge factor that people never talk about. Actually, I very rarely see on shows, and obviously, I, as someone who's not been a pro player in league or anything like that, wouldn't even be able to spot or out or tell you. But it's not about always what happens on screen, but also what doesn't happen on screen. For example, if the game's focused on a mid lane matchup and the 2 players are just farming, there might be a moment where a player goes to do something, but he can't because the other player has just moved in such a way where he's denied him. And it might be like a really skilled bit of play that just goes completely unseen, right? And again, that comes back to this idea of pro view, and you don't get to see the laning phases like through, from start to finish. And this was something that Nukeduck was always somewhat famed for as well, especially in scrims. Like this guy was always like legendary scrim reputation. It was always scrim god, scrim duck, whatever. Like Nukeduck would, so far as like sometimes he would just go like insane and just smash the lane and roam and win the game on his own and stuff like that. But even in unfavorable matchups, there was always like this sort of je ne sais quoi aspect, where it's like you could never properly punish him. It was like there was just something weird he was doing with his movement, just the way he was leaning to safe side, where it's like you never felt comfortable going in. You're never, or an average fan is never going to see that, or at least identify it on screen, right? And you're only going to know that if you talk to the guy. Let's say it's Caps, and you say, "Caps, how was it landing?" And just like so fucking annoying. Like, I feel like I had this guy shoved on the tower, but I just couldn't do anything with it. Like, and whenever I went to Rome, he would just step up slightly and delay me backing, and then I couldn't get tempo back, right? And all these small things that go unseen, only a player is going to be able to tell you how that feels and how that looks, right? So yeah, there's a lot of small things which, again, I kind of agree with Wickd, where maybe there are a few other people you could say, yeah, this guy's opinion's worth something, but ultimately it's the players, at least with the tools we currently have.
But I mean, a perfect example as well as a player you actually represent, right? Oda Amne. Look at what people thought about Oda Amne than he was on Schalke. And then look at what people think about Oda Amne, right? It's like, he just went from like here to like boom, instantly,
Yes.
you know? And it's not like his skill just changed instantly. Like, oh, I joined the team, I'm fucking Superman now. No, he was actually really good before as well. But it's just like, if the team isn't good, you can't do what you're supposed to do. And also, if you're playing weak side as a top laner, for example, or weak side as a bot laner, you're going to look a lot worse than your skill actually is, because you don't get resources. So you're always playing a little bit behind, a little bit weaker. You have to play a bit more passive. You can't really go for those outplays because, well, if I go for this outplay, there's a 20% chance the enemy jungler is here, and there's a 0% chance my jungler is here. So there's just not really the same opportunities. So,
as I mentioned on the show, you can already join the DJ Esports Worlds competition, the Worlds Prediction Series, where they have that enormous prize pool. If you haven't signed up yet, you get 400 DJT, which is their token, for free. Anyone with less than 1,500 in their balance can also post and share the event graphic on social media once a week, or reach out to the DJ Esports customer service staff in the DJ Esports Discord in order to get additional DJT. So check it out. This video was kindly supported by Kris with a K, Lager15, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Shenlong, Travis Goff, Wisetown, Zachary Carter, Zack Schmidt, ochs, Alexander Rao, Animosity, Butt Pounder 420, Kris, ErikHillestad, Hades, Jdubs, Jensen Goh, John Shelton, Joseph Ginsburg, Kovacevicd, Tobias Bernasconi, Zoomba, Zyrathenia, and a special thanks goes out to both Jerky's Minion and Joshua Gardner. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask one of those questions for my video AMA. Do you want teasers? Find out who the guests are for my upcoming shows. Maybe you even want to be a nerd having a long 2 or 3 hour discussion with me about anything on one of those video discussions. Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Skrilluminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.